what I would like to talk to you about is the process and experience of becoming a writer, and how you became the novelist that you are. Authors, it seems to me, are so often very private, and the discipline of writing involves a lot of isolation. And I just wanted to talk to you about the process of writing, how you keep going, how you turn an idea into a completed work.
It's interesting words, privacy. I write in airports. It's not particularly private. And what was the other one? Did you said something? Isolation.
Yeah.
Well, we're all isolated in airports, but those are two fears about writing. They're not necessarily the truth of the day, the writing day, which is one of very problematic but interesting and rewarding connection. You're working. You've got the work. You've got the work for company. You have your characters for company. It's a busy enough day, even though you're not talking to anyone real. And it's full of, I'm very attached to it, is I think the best way of putting it. And it's a great resource for me. And it's the kind of thing that if I have problems elsewhere, I'd go and write. So somebody said to me years ago, most people try and get holidays from their work. Writers are the only people that she knew who try to get holidays in order to work. That you have a craving to get to the work. You have a big want for the work. If you're kept from it, you're cranky, you're very poor company. And when you're working, it's not always easy, and you're not always, in great form. But there was the last 6 months of the last book I was doing, and it was so good you couldn't buy it. I had my book. I'd been looking for the book. I'd been dunting against the book. It was full of, I was figuring things out for 2 or 3 years. The last 6 months, I had the book. I had the roll of the book. And it was a glory of possession, and it was brilliant. It was just great. And, I'm in my 50s. Fantastic. So, so I'm not too worried about a process that makes a lot of people anxious. I know there are anxieties within it, but I just would clarify. I'm really interested, sadly, sad bastard that I am. I'm very interested in what I do. So I suppose that kind of self-enclosure, that kind of useful selfishness gets me through.
The role of the book and being in it, that last 6 months is the moment.
Yeah.
That's amazing. So it seems you've been publishing since 1991. 6 novels, a 7th on the way, 3 collections of short stories, and the book about motherhood, which I want to come to in a moment. But the sense I've had from reading your work, as I've read a lot in the last few weeks, is of you really in a moment of kind of deep and realised kind of creative power. I mean, it
I don't know.
Comes across.
Yeah.
I just wondered what that feels like. Is that the way it feels to you, or does that feel kind of very fragile?
Yeah. I mean, again, you're talking about connectivity and fragility, and I had been, I think, in my 40s, hedged about in my creative sense of myself by ideas of authority. And somehow the creator is interrupted or judged by some sense of external authority. And as I became more and more aware of what that was, both more in my own psyche than in the world, though it became also apparent in the world, particularly for Irish women writers, how that was playing, or what that weird standoff was between people who presented themselves as authority and people who presented themselves as creative. It was quite an interesting dynamic going on there, and one that was quite damaging, I thought, to the writing community. But once that became apparent to me, once I started looking at issues of gender, once when Trump got elected, these things made all our ideas of authority and of, in the mythopoetic sense, male authority, much more radical and interesting, and we just started questioning these things much more usefully, I think. There had been in decades prior to that the kind of "why don't you like us" feeling from women. It's like, why don't you like us? We're trying our best, we're really good, we're really competent, and they're trying to impress the unimpressible, which is quite a weird thing to try and do when you could just, write your stuff and be happy. So yes, in this last few books, I have been interested in developing my range, my scope as a writer. I kind of know I can do yada yada, and I can do. I said, well, maybe I'll do this. I'll do a broader book. The Green Road was a broader book geographically. I wanted to go worldwide with my characters, and then. Actress I don't know what it is yet, but it's a different one again,
Well, I'm going to go on to the theme of birth. So the book Making Babies, stumbling into motherhood. It seemed to me, I've just read it. I found it so moving. I picked up the phone and read bits of it down the phone to my sister. Yes. I just was absolutely transfixed by it. It's about more than motherhood. It seemed to me to be a book about a kind of journey into creative self-confidence.
Really?
That's the way I read it. But the bit that really struck me was the story of you going off to do your MA in creative writing. And you write about, being on the boat to England with a typewriter and a single suitcase, and of sitting, and this is UEA, in an evil little breeze block room from 8 p.m. till 4 a.m. every night for 8 months in a row. I loved that kind of evocation. And I just wondered if you could think a bit about, that moment in your life, and think then to, students coming to study creative writing. What advice would you give them about getting started as a creative writer?
They knocked that building down, that evil little breeze block room, it was called Waveney Terrace. And I went back to UEA, and I walked down to Waveney Terrace, and it was rubble behind. I took a selfie. There's the rubble of that building, overgrown, and here am I. Not so much doctorated, but, here. It was a real moment of survival for me. I was very isolated from Ireland and my family and from everyone I knew at home when I went to UEA. And when I think about it, I was a vulnerable student. So sitting there for what it does, it alerts me to vulnerability among my own student cohort. And people... But it's like, I did a week-long yoga course once, and people were going mad there too. Like, when you're doing something new, when you're taken out of your environment and you're just up against nothing, there's nothing, all the things you think you're fighting are gone. Yeah. So there's nothing else but you and it, whatever it is. The goddamn triangle pose. But in this case, the great novel, which is what I was going to write in UEA. And so that there was me in it, and it won for sure, So, but it is a very interesting time where the silt of your life is disturbed, where new possibilities happen, or bad things happen too. People fall apart, and that was basically what I did. Not to put too fine a point on it, but then the building fell apart, and I'm still standing. So yeah. So
in a way, what you're saying was a sort of almost a necessary journey into vulnerability.
I wouldn't knock. I wouldn't knock the Waveney Terrace. I wouldn't knock the creative writing MA process. It was very particular to my circumstances and my talent at the time. And I think the ability to go through things, to learn resilience, to know what failure is, these are all absolutely vital to anyone going through. I was really interested in an article in the New York Times the other day about people who fail early actually have a better chance of a longer career if they build on failure, rather than people who flame wonderfully, beautifully as a young talent, and then how do they continue. That you know, there's always a downside to success and to failure. You know, how you calibrate, how you manage your own resources through your writing life.
Yeah, it makes me think about that famous Beckett quote. You know, the
Fail
one.
better.
Yeah, no matter, fail again.
Yeah.
No matter, try again, fail
Again, fail
better. Yes, that's right.
I used to dream about Samuel Beckett on that ferry over to UEA that I would meet. I met him repeatedly in my dreams. As you know, he was on the ferry, sitting in the corner, looking.
We didn't die till 1989.
No, I might have met him on the ferry. Yeah.
Yeah. So if we fast forward 20 years from the breeze blocks of UEA and back in England 20 years later in the more glittering context of the Guildhall, 2007, and you get the Booker Prize for The Gathering, that's a fantastic validation of the process you've gone through and of the value of the book.
Yeah, it's slightly Fantasyland validation. Yeah, there are other validations than the Booker, and there's no final or useful validation. You know, there's only
your own reckoning.
Well, yeah, there's only the next book. There's only the interest. There's only the process, really, I suppose.
Did you find that the Booker put you off in any way? Did it make you nervous about the next book?
It was very complex engagement with the world and not just the world, the kind of madness of it all. I had in the Guildhall a kind of atavistic nationalist moment when I saw Wellington up on the wall. Remember him? He's the one who said, just because you're born in Ireland, he was born in Ireland, and he said, just because you're born in a stable doesn't mean that you're a horse, he said, about being born in Ireland. So it was interesting to be in the belly of some imperial beast there in the middle of London. I liked that. I did like that. I didn't talk about it much at the time. For good reasons, because of course we're very grateful.
Well, the fact check.
Oh God, yes. I mean, writers are seldom making enough money, and actually since the Booker, the income has reduced in real terms for writers by 30% because of the encroachments of Amazon. So I was so enormously lucky. In terms of the de-stressing. It's incredibly stressful not to have money. You look at Anna Burns was on food aid before the Booker. It is a real benefit, and I never knock the money or say the money isn't important, because it's not what writers are in it for. God help them. They're so stupid. And it's so useful. But that took me a long time to realise. The initial stresses were extreme, and I was on the road for a year. I found it hurried up a lot of the processes in my life, made them quicker. So it was a kind of quantum shift where I would have preferred to grow more slowly. And the next book was deliberately less ambitious than The Gathering had been, because I wanted to be safe enough when I went out into the world again. Then by the Green Road, I was happy doing whatever I wanted to. So it did soften my cough, as they say in Ireland. That'll soften your cough. So it did knock the wind out of my creative sails for a while. But I'm very fierce, you know. It's like, taking my work away, it's like, don't touch my Carlsberg, you know. So you can't take my writing away from me, you know. And so I was quite fierce for a few years holding on to that. But yeah.
I just want to move on. I mean, as you know, I teach English here, and I'm very aware that the context in which English is taught has changed. You mentioned, in a way, a kind of collapse of patriarchal authority. That's one of the big themes of our time. But there are many changes, in how English, in our attitude to the literary canon, the rise of creative writing as a discipline, the kinds of students who turn up to do English. And I I wondered if you could talk a little bit, going right back even pre-MA to your own education. I know you did English at Trinity. Talking about how formative was that experience for you in terms of your development as a writer? Because it was an intensive reading process.
Before I went to Trinity, now I went to St. Louis and Rathmines, and we did, short stories every couple of weeks, and really, really poor selection of novels for the leaving certificate. It was Men Withering or Hard Times by Charles Dickens. It was awful. And I managed to do both my intercert and my leaving cert without reading the books. I didn't think that was strictly speaking necessary. So, anyway, after that I had, by some strange kind of freak, I went to Canada for 2 years, and I had an English teacher called Theo Dombrowski, and everyone has a teacher. He was my teacher. He was so good. He was so inflected and ironic. He loved Joyce. He was a Joycean. He had written on Ulysses. But he did, in a very laid-back sort of way, very wry sort of way, indicate what had not been known in St. Louis Rathmines, the idea that you could write about real things. You could write about things that were ironic and so therefore double, if not strictly speaking real, but also that you could write about sex, for example. There was La Belle Dame Sans Merci was the first day of class. He said, she looked at me as she did love and made sweet moan. And he said, well, we all know what that means. I was shocked to my core. I went up after as I was 16. I said, how dare you ruin Keats for me by making it into a dirty poem? So he looked at me like, okay, here we go. So it was a bit of a kind of...
a bit of the Catholic Dublin of the,
but
80s.
With all the moral outrage of the young.
Yeah.
Yeah, which when students, I see them being a bit moral and a bit outraged, and I think, oh, God, get over yourself here. And then I remember myself at 16 saying to Theo Dombrowski, how dare you ruin Keats by saying there was sex in this poem. And, So that was me too. There I was. Anyway, so that was transformative. His interest in my sentences was amazing. He wrote bits of red on my essays. You had to write your essays on every second line, so he could write even more words.
In between, yeah.
Yeah. I still remember I had ... I can't remember on the page. He said, what are these worm droppings doing on the page? My punctuation and my run-on sentences. He didn't fix them clearly. He'd go, run on! I had no idea what he was talking, dangling modifier, all these things. So I went into Trinity full of a weird Canadian confidence, and that thing didn't happen to me. That thing where you turn conscientious or something. I was always kind of wanted to be slapdash and interesting rather than thoroughgoing,
Yeah, I can imagine Trinity might have been a very different experience if you hadn't had that Canadian kind of...
Well, if you're coming out of the Leaving Cert,
yeah,
and that tendency of girls particularly to do well in their exams, and then you want to do well in your English, and that's a kind of... that can be, you have to shake that out of your system one way or the other. But Trinity was a very nurturing and pastorally very wonderful place for me, actually. I did a great Shakespeare course with Nicky Green. I wrote about King Lear every year for Nicky Green. He never complained. He never said, could you read another play? Have you been to the theatre? We were in the theatre all the time. So I'd be writing these. We were doing student drama, and it was very, very playful, useful time.
Yes, a wonderful place. I went there as well, actually, and I was taught by Nicky Green too, so something we have in common. Thinking now then about your teaching, because you're back, in a way, you've kind of started to teach creative writing, you're professor of creative writing at UCD. How do you feel about the process now? Do you think, for example, how vexed do you feel about the idea that creativity is something which can be taught or curated? Is that a...
Perhaps I do a very simple thing. I look at people's sentences and I say, if you're going to start with the word it, then that's going to run in I look at their use of tense. I look at their semicolons. I look at their run-on and their dangling modifiers, and I say, well, what is this then? What are you doing? So that's an enormously simple thing to do. I don't fuss their creativity, and I don't tell them they're doing the wrong thing or writing the wrong book or the market will like it or the market won't like it. I respect the imperative that they bring, the sense of imperative that they bring when they present characters or a story, that there is an urgency there somewhere that is, there's a sense of necessity. And it's not, so I'm more about disciplining creativity than encouraging it. Stamp it out. No, I don't say stamp it out. I'm just saying there's no lack of it. So I just want to give the students a place to stand on their own page so they can go anywhere.
But you're almost back to where Theo, I can't remember his surname.
Theo Dombrowski.
Was with your
Yes.
kind of editing
Yes.
between the sentences, between the lines.
Yeah, I wouldn't say editing either. I would say observing. But I think as a writer, I tend to have a great idea for a book that then doesn't ever get written, because when I'm working on the page is doing something else. So the key, or just the trick, is to read your own work very carefully, to say what are the tensions and problems that are held in your use of language here. Yeah? Why do you want an elegiac continuous present tense? Why aren't you here in the room now? What is it that, why don't you want to land your character into. So it's about the relationship of language to the world and to reality and to, emotional reality and things like that. But also I can read. That's what I do. I don't teach, I read.
Well, you mentioned the market and, writing, if you want to achieve that kind of public recognition, you have to negotiate with the market and with an agent and with a publisher and find your way forward. And one of the really dramatic shifts in how the literary marketplaces works in our time is the shift to digital, to what you might describe as digital authorship. And, we have authors tweeting all the time. I don't know if you noticed this, but, Margaret Atwood, who is about to be 80, is a voluminous tweeter and has a remarkably well-curated web page with lots of updates about her work and a full bibliography and, extra bits for readers and so on. I just wondered how you felt about that whole business of online presence for authors who have a print identity and a presence in a bookshop.
Okay, well, first of all, before we get to digital, you could say that it's not the job of, I don't see it as my job as a creative writing instructor to get a book into a marketable shape. There are too many marketable books out there. The market is bored with its own marketability, and what they're looking for is the anomalous and the interesting. And so you get books coming from somewhere else. You get them coming from left field and from small presses, particularly in Ireland, but also in Britain. And that can or can't be taught. That's not within the structure somehow of what I'm doing. That's one thing. You don't want to make your own talent you don't want to tame your talent by doing a course. You want to be as wild and interesting as you need to be. And the other thing about the digital is, we're talking about commodifying the novel.
Yeah.
And one thing I've noticed in, say, the success of Emer McBride's A Girl Is Not That Form thing, it was wonderful reading that book because there was no temptation to click away online. This was something you could never find online. If you write a book now that somebody can find an article that's shorter and more interesting, then they'll do that. So your novel has to present something, present something that can't be found in the kind of digital free space. And that's why people will buy it and treasure it and maybe get a hardback and put that on their shelves. As far as the tweeting, That's really tough, you know, because the publishers do say to people, if you have a social media presence, that will help. And sometimes they take people on board because they have a social media presence, and the book follows the social media presence. That said, I look at people now and think that we were writing in the dark. It took a year before you knew whether your book had been received well. Yeah. It took a year before you knew what you were doing. And these young people are so enormously savvy. I'm a little bit envious, a little bit scared, and a little bit kind of happy for them. I'm worried that actually being savvy takes the place of writing the books, you know. However, you know, writers' personas always were part of the world. So it feeds both ways. You think of, you know, people think of writers as private people, like Emily Dickinson, but you look at Byron, and he was out there, you know, fighting for Greek independence and being in the newspapers. And that fed into his work as well. So the privacy of Emily Dickinson's privacy is in her poetry.
I can't imagine Emily Dickinson ever having been a tweeter. I mean, if she seemed to be, I mean, privacy seemed to be so strongly attached to her sense of authorship.
Yeah, no, nor could you imagine John McGahern being a tweeter.
No.
And McGahern is interesting because those early works of McGahern were so intensely, immensely, absolutely taboo-breakingly private, yes, that what he was saying to the wider public was almost unseeable in the text. Like I read those early books and didn't know what was going on, what he was talking about, what his father was up to, the character's father in the books. So what he was doing was breaking or leaking out a most amazing story about privacy to the public world. Ireland didn't really thank him for it. So I don't know, it's a case-by-case thing. I find I wrote that baby book now, and I feel a bit cringy because I said very private things in it, things that I experienced as private, about my children, about my attitude to my own mortality, and they were intensely private to me. So I thought, what kind of idiot was I telling the whole world about that? And I thought, well, you know, at the time, I wrote it because it was urgently true, and also because I needed to pay for the goddamn disposable nappies. It was like, you know, what do? You're a writer, you have children. I mean, you can't think about anything else. You might as well write about them, make a few.
The bit that really moved me and fascinated me and made me pick up the phone to my sister and say, let me read you this. My sister's just had a baby.
Oh, yeah.
Was the apologies all round.
Oh, yeah.
That was the bit that sort of I just thought was fantastic. I mean,
yes.
You know, the way mothers apologise for everything.
I know, it's quite an Irish book because those American chicks writing about babies, they apologise for nothing.
Yes.
And they're really quite cross. A lot of those books now are quite cross. Yeah. And I was quite cross too, but I was also amazed. I mean, I was really amazed by the process of reproduction. It's such an open secret. Who knew?
Well, and you know, once you've had children, it's never going to be the same. Your whole attitude to your own creativity, to your time.
Okay, well, there was the day after I had my daughter, and I realised I could write a novel really easily. Like, what had I been? I mean, it was all there in my head. I had the novel. I could see the novel. I had the novel. I had a baby. Novels are easy. Look what I fucking produced already. Novel, no problem. And I had it all in my head, and I was gonna ring my husband and tell him, everything's going to be okay, I'm going to write a novel in 6 months and then we can have another baby. Isn't that great news? And then I realised I didn't know my own phone number or the home phone number or his phone number. So that my brain was completely gone. So,
but you did get down in that. I mean,
I did. I wrote 6 weeks later, yeah.
And you started to write The Gathering. And
I did,
that was, I mean, The Gathering is the first novel after...
No, Eliza Lynch. I wrote that.
Yeah.
When I was pregnant, I wrote that.
Wow.
The second time. Hard to write when you're pregnant. It's like writing a poem when you're waiting for a bus.
Yeah. Though there is a genre of pregnancy poem. That's another.
Oh yeah.
That's a sort of whole kind of subgenre in itself. Really.
I found I was too busy imagining the child to imagine much else.
Yeah.
The first time around. Yeah.
Right, I have a last question, which is, this is a big one.
Oh, yeah.
What is it that the study of literature can teach? what kind of advice might you give to a person studying English at university? That's two questions.
I still believe in the novel as a way of bringing us all further on. And I think the novel is an amazing engine for doing that. And, you know, you spend 5 years writing one, or 3 years, or 2 years, or whatever, but there's an amazing amount of, it's a kind of world of itself with its own texture, its own language, its own grain. It's an amazing intellectual machine. And it's also a very useful way of developing our empathy and our understanding. And as well as developing abstract intellectual ideas, but also engaging politically and socially with the world. I mean, what doesn't it do? It's just a great, moving, kinetic kind of piece of intellectual kit. So I don't fret about the future of literature in the way that, and I don't worry about the canon. It was never my friend. What the hell? Yeah, but also narrative forms move into the box set, and then into the, you know, they move into other mediums and forms, and what downloadability does to our ideas of narrative. It's moving all the time, but what stays constant is this idea that stories are useful, and that there aren't that many of them.
Thank you very much indeed for coming to Loughborough. It's been a great pleasure to talk to you about your ideas about being and becoming a novelist and the process of teaching creative writing.
Thank you, Claire.